Without objection, so ordered.
I thank the chair. Mr. President, in 3 days' time across our country, from the North Country of New Hampshire to his final resting place in Simi Valley, California, Americans will celebrate the legacy of President Ronald Reagan. It will be the occasion of the 100th anniversary of his birth, and I'm really honored to rise today to join other colleagues of both parties and others throughout the United States and I'm sure the world in paying tribute to America's 40th president. I cannot speak as personally about President Reagan as some in this chamber can. I met him only a few times when, as a visiting state attorney general during the 80s, I was at the White House. He was always gracious, always responsive to us. But I did have one meeting that I might call a virtual meeting with President Reagan that reminds me of his enduring importance for our country today. 22 years ago, on January 4th, 1989, as President Reagan was departing the White House, having completed his second term, I had just arrived in Washington as a freshman senator from Connecticut. President Reagan was set to give his final weekly radio address on that brisk Saturday morning, and then Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell had honored me by asking me if I would give the Democratic response. It was a real honor, although a daunting one, for me to be asked to do that on that occasion. Looking back, I believe that President Reagan's 331st and final radio address on that January morning was among the most masterful and moving of his career. In it, he captured the very essence of the American spirit. He said, whether we seek it or not, whether we like it or not, we Americans are keepers of the miracles. We are asked to be guardians of a place to come to, a place to start again, a place to live in the dignity God meant for his children. May it ever be so, President Reagan concluded that morning. Needless to say, President Reagan's final radio address was, quite literally, a tough act to follow. In my remarks, I praised him for his love of country, for his fervent devotion to freedom, and for his commitment to the values of faith, flag, and family. I was, as I put it then, inspired and encouraged by his patriotism. And I urged all Americans to work on our unfinished business and the challenges ahead with the spirit of purpose and confidence that is the legacy of the Reagan years, end quote. Today, 22 years later, I continue to feel deeply honored that I was able to deliver those remarks and ever more confident of the importance of Ronald Reagan's legacy to us and the generations of Americans to come. The optimism, moral clarity, and confidence that President Reagan radiated inspired a generation, and they are precisely the ideals that we need today to rekindle and re-inspire the current generation of Americans and others, frankly, living without freedom around the world. I didn't always agree with President Reagan, that's a matter of public record, but I always understood the enduring value and strength and sincerity of his faith in America's values and America's destiny. In 1980, Ronald Reagan promised to make America great again, and he did. He expressed with total confidence that those who would challenge our hard-won freedoms would collapse. And they did. He led our country and the free world to victory in the Cold War against Soviet communism. And he never doubted for a moment that America and our cause could and would prevail. When in 1977, Ronald Reagan was asked about his vision for the end of the Cold War, remember he wasn't yet president, he responded with characteristic and refreshing directness. He said, and I quote, "My idea of American policy toward the Soviet Union is simple, and some would say simplistic. It is this: we win and they lose," end quote. But President Reagan's understanding of world affairs was far from simplistic. He was an optimist without illusions, who was guided by and frankly expressed moral judgments about what was right and what was wrong. We don't see that enough today. There's a kind of relativism afoot, but some things are just plain wrong and some things, thank God, are just plain right. President Reagan had the moral clarity to make distinctions between good and evil and the moral courage to speak the truth of those distinctions unambiguously and to support them unwaveringly. When he addressed an audience of veterans and world leaders commemorating the 40th anniversary of D-Day, standing as he spoke on the windswept coast of northern France, the very clifftop in Normandy, where courageous Allied soldiers fought to liberate Europe from the yoke of Nazi tyranny, President Reagan magnificently, masterfully, compellingly revealed again his moral clarity, and I'm honored to quote these words today on this floor. The men of Normandy, Reagan said, had faith that what they were doing was right, faith that they fought for all humanity, faith that a just God would grant them mercy on this beachhead or on the next. It was the deep knowledge, and pray God we have not lost it, that there is a profound moral difference between the use of force for liberation and the use of force for conquest. You were here, he said to the veterans, to liberate, not to conquer, and so you and those others did not doubt your cause. You were right not to doubt. You all knew that some things are worth dying for. One's country is worth dying for, and democracy is worth dying for, because it's the most deeply honorable form of government ever devised by man. All of you loved liberty, President Reagan concluded. All of you were willing to fight tyranny, and you knew the people of your countries were behind you. End of quote. It's thrilling just to read those words again. Yet President Reagan never spoke about America's enemies belligerently. Rather, he spoke firmly and frankly about the deep divide between our morality and that of the Soviet Union. In doing so, I think he reawakened in all of us the belief that every human being has the potential to change history, because history, as Reagan knew, is made not by abstract, inexorable forces, but by real live men and women. It was President Ronald Reagan who came to the defense of the dissidents in their fight against the Soviet Union and reminded the world that a single courageous human face, a single courageous voice can tear down the faceless inhumanity of a massive repressive system such as the Soviet Union. The great Soviet dissident and later Israeli leader and human rights activist Natan Sharansky once shared with me his memory of the moment when he first learned of President Reagan's 1982 speech before the British Parliament, the speech in which Reagan described the Soviet Union as an evil empire. There were some here in this country who thought that was much too stark and disrespectful. But Sharansky, who was a prisoner for nearly a decade in the Soviet Gulag, described to me how word of Reagan's speech spread through that heartless prison as he and his fellow dissidents tapped on walls and talked through pipes and even toilets to communicate the extraordinary news that the leader of the free world had spoken the truth, a truth, as Sharansky put it, and I quote, that burned inside the heart of each and every one of us, end quote. Indeed, President Reagan was willing to expose an inconvenient truth about the Soviet Union that unsettled and unnerved some of his contemporaries who feared his undiplomatic words were a threat to stability. And the truth is, they were. President Reagan refused to accept the stability of an authoritarian status quo that consigned millions of people to live under perpetual tyranny. And so he did challenge the stability of the Berlin Wall and the Gulag and the Stasi, and in doing so, his moral courage helped inspire the men and women who brought down the Iron Curtain, and expanded the frontiers of freedom. In his approach to foreign policy, President Ronald Reagan embodied that quintessentially American combination of idealism and pragmatism. He understood what America was about, which is freedom and opportunity, and he fought to extend those great values here at home and throughout the world. In his final words to the nation as our president, in a radio address on that January morning 22 years ago, President Reagan shared a story about a meeting Winston Churchill had with a group of American journalists in 1952. It was a time when many doubted whether the president could meet the challenges of the Cold War and whether the West could meet the challenges of the Cold War and prevail. Churchill asked the reporters, what other nation in history, when it became supremely powerful, has had no thought of territorial aggrandizement, no ambition but to use its resources for the good of the world? I marvel, Churchill said, at America's altruism, her sublime disinterestedness. End of quote. Churchill's friend and physician, Lord Moran, described the Prime Minister's demeanor as he spoke. All at once I realized, Lord Moran wrote, Winston was in tears. His eyes were red, his voice faltered, he was deeply moved. End of quote. I think President Reagan was drawn to that story in his final radio address to the nation 22 years ago because he understood that in that moment, Churchill understood and acknowledged the greatness of the American spirit. Imperfect though we are as human beings, it is the spirit that explains who we are and expresses all we aspire to be. He saw America's devotion to a cause that has defined us for over 2 centuries, a cause greater than our own individual self-interest or even national self-interest very often, and that has given us an enduring purpose to our national destiny, and that is the cause of human dignity and human freedom. At a time when we face many challenges both at home and abroad, and when it has unfortunately become fashionable to suggest that our best days as a nation are behind us, President Ronald Reagan's optimism and his abiding faith in America are more important to remember than ever before. They are as wise as they are true. Our shared national destiny, Mr. President, has always inspired us as Americans and propelled us forward together. It is the spirit that Ronald Reagan re-inspired in America at a time of great peril. And it is the spirit, I know, at this time of peril, here at home and around the world, that can carry us forward and continue to make us the greatest nation on earth and the last best hope of mankind. I thank the chair, and I yield the floor.